One of the more common questions I'm asked is, what requirements do I need in order to be able to install and run Visual Studio.NET effectively? I should note right here that the version of Visual Studio I'm running is Beta 2. So I don't have a released version. We don't know exactly what the date is of that release. With respect to processor, one should have at least a Pentium 3 class processor, 733 or higher. This is a pretty sound recommendation. I wouldn't really try this on a P2 266 or something like that. Really go with a better processor. With respect to RAM, 256 is the recommendation, and I think that's a pretty good one. I would not try this with 64 at all, and 128 it does fairly well, but 256 is always better. Of course, a gig of RAM is always better, but depending on what you can afford and what your machine can accommodate, go as high as you can. Hard disk space, you need 3 gigabytes. Now that's a lot. A lot of that is for documentation, samples, tools, things like that. The truth is, the .NET SDK, if you were just installing the .NET Runtime, it's pretty small. Installing Visual Studio does take up a fair amount of room if you do a full install. In the video area, the recommendation is for 1024 by 768. Make sure it's high color. That's also a good recommendation. The IDE has a lot of panes and windows, and that makes it hard to see if you're using smaller screen size. CD-ROM is definitely required, although if you have the CD and you put the files out on the network, you can install from the network, but CD-ROM really should be what you have. And operating system, you need Windows 2000 or NT4, and I would recommend actually just doing Windows 2000. Here's what the IDE looks like then. After you get Visual Studio up and running, here's what you're going to see. And as you look through here, you see a few different things. This is where we can work with our forms. We can also look, if we click here, we'll be able to see our code that runs behind there. We have here the Solution Explorer. These are the properties of this form showing right here. So we have a properties window. We have help that we can click on here and get some good help. We can also look at, if we clicked here, we could see output regarding the compilation of our program. These are features, some of these are features we'll be describing in this course. There's a lot going on inside of Visual Studio, and we certainly couldn't cover every aspect of it. Our focus is to pay attention to those aspects that will get us farther in starting our applications. Some of the features of the IDE are these. All of the languages, no matter which language you use in Visual Studio, you're going to have the same IDE. This is great. If you train developers who are accustomed to using VB.NET, in the features of the IDE, those same features will be the same ones that C# developers will use. So that's pretty nice. All of your project types are designed in the same IDE as well. So if you're designing a Windows application, a web application, a web service, you're going to be using the same IDE, the same tools, no matter which language or project type you create. The projects can employ items from multiple languages. So as you go through and use this IDE, you're going to be creating projects, and because you have this multi-language support, that allows you to have projects that have items from multiple languages. As you work with Visual Studio, your main focus will be working within projects. So what we want to do is look at how to create solutions and projects and how to then manage those. So a solution inside of Visual Studio works like this. Visual Studio uses a special container called a solution, and this is really, it amounts to a file, and that file has within it references to the projects that you are working on. Solutions are a lot like Visual Basic project groups. If you remember back to the previous versions of Visual Studio, you would go into Visual Basic, you could have one project, and then you could add another project to what you were working on, and it would create a project group. It's a similar concept here, although some of the settings and things you can do with solutions are a lot richer than what you could do with project groups. So each solution then can have one or more projects, and that solution will contain all of the files and the items needed for your applications and all your projects to be developed, debugged, and deployed. If solutions contain projects, then projects contain items. So the project itself will have items that comprise the whole executable application. including resource files, modules, forms, classes, things like that. Data connections, controls, these are other things that we will add to projects. Here we're looking at an example of a project within the Solution Explorer. So what we see is we have a project called Customers, and we notice that it has references. We also have our form as well as some assembly information for the code behind our form. What we can tell then is that a project contains items. An important thing to note about the way projects work in Visual Studio.net is that the names of forms are now congruous with the names of our files. Whereas in previous versions of Visual Studio, if one were to create a form, the name inside of the name property would be one thing, and how it was actually stored out on the file system had a completely different name. And this created a lot of confusion for developers because it could be named clown on the hard disk, but it could have a completely different name inside the project, and that incongruity has been erased with the introduction of Visual Studio.net. When you create a project, there are some settings you can set for the whole project. Its assembly name, the name of the project itself, its location, where is it stored, its startup object. Some of these are similar to settings for projects that we've seen in Visual Studio 6 and before. Also an output type, a root namespace, and some designer defaults. Here's what the general settings look like for projects. So we can see that we have the name of our assembly. So this is what ultimately the project is going to be called after we build it. It's going to be called Customers. Our startup object is Form 1. We could have hit this drop down and chosen a different one. Also our root namespace, which is Customers. Inside of our project is going to be some namespace called Customers, and we'll take a look at that inside the project when we create it. Here we can see where it's being stored and what the name of this file is, and what its final output name will be, customers.exe. There are other properties that we can set for this project. For example, some debugging options, an output path or directory for our build, some code optimization settings, and the character set that we're going to be using. Here's what those settings look like. So as we look in here, when we run this project within the IDE, we just want to start the project. Or we could start an external program. There's some other options we can use here. If our project is using some command line, will respond to some command line arguments, we could specify those here. In this demonstration, what we want to do is actually create a project and set some of these settings ourselves. So what we're going to do is open up our Visual Studio.net development environment. After you start Visual Studio, you'll see this the very first time you arrive. And this is a nice start page, all web enabled, that will let you specify not only that you want to start a new project or open a project, but there are also some convenient hyperlinks over here to some places you might want to go. So maybe go to the downloads, search online for some information that you might need in creating your application. There's some convenient things over here. Our focus, though, is on creating a brand new application. So what we're going to do is we are going to create a brand new project. When we click on New Project, we are offered a number of templates for how we want to create the new project. So what we see here are, for example, Visual Basic projects, and these are templates with respect to Visual Basic. We could click on Visual C# projects, and we would see other templates. Now these will often be for the same categories. For example, Windows application here in C# and a Windows application in Visual Basic. C++ projects, we'll see some different things. For example, using the Active Templates library here, using ATL, and some things that we won't see if we click on C# or in Visual Basic. Interestingly, in Visual Studio, you can also create what are called setup and deployment projects. And these are integrated with Windows Installer. So instead of having to go out and buy a third-party tool in order to create Windows Installer, you can actually just click on one of these and it will create a setup project using Windows Installer, and they can be customized. There are other projects. We won't look in depth at these at this time, but there are other projects, for example, database projects and other analyzer projects that you can create. Our focus is to just get started creating an application. We're going to focus on Visual Basic for now. What we want to do is create a Windows application. So we click on this template. Now, these templates exist on the hard disk. They can be modified so that you can have your own custom templates. And we could add these to the templates library. So if you have our corporate template, you could put that template inside of here, and other developers then could use it. What we're going to do is create a new application, and we'll just call this one Students 1. Something simple. Notice as we typed, we've already specified a location. This is a default location that we specified previously. We could choose a different place by clicking Browse here and navigate to another place on the system where we would like to store our projects. We will look later on in a different demonstration on how to integrate Visual SourceSafe with Visual Studio. So for now, we're just going to keep our projects directory as where we're going to put this. Notice that we already had one solution open back here in the background, and we want to close that solution before we add the new one so that we have a brand new solution and we can add new projects to that solution. We could actually add our project that we're creating now, Students 1, to the solution that's open that already has another project in it. But we won't. We'll create a brand new solution. If we click on More here, we'll see that we can create a directory for our solution. So right now, the whole thing is going to be created inside of C:\projects. Whereas if I click here, it's going to create a Students 1 directory and then create the project in Students 1 here. So what we'll do is we'll create a directory for our solution. After we've specified those things, we've chosen our template, we've specified a name, we've chosen a location, and we know what the final solution name is going to be. We will go ahead and create it. Here's what the application looks like after we have created it. So what we see is a blank form that's put up that will be there by default. We also see the name of our solution, Students 1, which contains one project. Here is our Students 1 project. I like this hierarchical view so that it makes it easier to navigate the files. When some of the applications that we create in .NET will have dozens and dozens of files here, so it's kind of convenient to be able to navigate them this way. So we have our Form 1 as well as the code behind it. We have our references, and this is called the Solution Explorer, and we'll be looking more in detail at what we can do inside of there. One of the things that we can do in Solution Explorer is show all of the files. If we do have a large number of files listed here, there's an icon right here that says Show All Files, and it will actually break all of them out so we can see what's listed here. It doesn't make a big impact right now because we don't have very much in here, but if we did, this could be fairly useful. One of the things we want to do right now is just make some property settings. So we're going to right-click on the name of our project and go down to Properties. We'll open that up and we'll see the dialog boxes we saw in one of our slides. We have some general settings, the name of our assembly, what type of output do we have here? Well, we have a Windows application. We could change that, although changing this could affect some of the implementation that we've already put in our application. Right now we could do it without very much impact because our application doesn't really do anything yet. Then our startup object, we're only really going to have two options here, and that is Form 1 and Submain. We're not using Submain right now, so Form 1 seems like the best option for starting your application. We'll have a root namespace of Students 1 as we look in there. We have some build information. Maybe we want to change an icon here for our application. Whether we want option explicit to be on or off by default. By default, it is on. Option explicit keeps us from using variables that we have not declared in the application. It's a bad idea to start using variables if they haven't been declared because they will throw an error at times, or they'll use data types that are not really best suited for performance. So that's important. Option strict is off by default, and the option strict has to do with whether we're using the strongest typing possible. So these are some of the compiler defaults, and typically we leave these the way they are in the defaults. Here are the namespaces that we're already importing, so system.windows.forms, and then system.drawing, system.data. These are there by default. We're not using anything inside of reference path or strong name. There are some designer defaults that are useful to us, and that is our page layout is on a grid, which we can see right here. And right now, if we were to output this to a web browser, if there was some aspect of our program that would go to a web browser, it would go to IE5. We're not really using these because we have a Windows Forms application instead of a web-based application, but they're nice to know. Some of the other configuration settings we can do is when we're going to debug mode. So as we debug the application, we just want to start it straight away. So when I start the application in debug, it's just going to start it. There's no external program or anything else I want to do. Again, if our application could respond to command line arguments, we could put those in here. And so right now we're not worried about that because, again, we have a simple application. Optimizations are kind of interesting because this is where we can remove integer overflow checks. This has to do with the way the CPU checks really it has more to do with the way the runtime checks for overflows. If we have an integer, for example, that is going to have a number that's too high in it, we can check that. But we're going to remove those integer overflow checks here and just write very good code, and this will improve the performance of our application. If we wrote sloppy code, we might want to check this box. And there are some other optimizations we can enable by checking there, and we can enable incremental builds so that we don't have to recompile everything every time. We can just compile incrementally as we go. In our build environment, then, we're going to output our debug out to a bin directory in the directory where we're storing the whole project. We're going to enable some build warnings. So when we build the application, we'll see in an output box if there's any problem with the application, we'll see some output there. There are some other conditional compilation constants we can put in here, and conditional compilations allow us to do things. For example, if there is some code in our application that we want to only run in debug mode, we can specify some constants here. Or if there's a specific language I want to use as I debug, and by language, I'm talking about human language here, speakable language. So maybe as I compile it this time, I want to compile my French version of the program, and maybe when I compile it the next time, I want to do the German version. So we could specify some of those. Deployment is for much later on, and this has to do with how we ultimately will deploy and distribute the application. So those are some of the settings that we can do there. Now, we want to add some items to our application. Right now, we just have this blank form. What we'll see over on the left is a toolbox, and this toolbox will allow us to add some different controls to our form. One of the ones that I really like that they've added now in Visual Studio.net is this link label, which allows labels to actually be hyperlinked. And this is something that was kind of inconvenient in previous versions of the controls. You could not have a label on here and then actually turn it into a hyperlink unless you bought a custom control. You'll notice that as this toolbox comes out, it will disappear as I move away from it. And that's because I haven't actually used this little feature that you'll see right up here. If I click here, it will make it so that it's permanently available. If I click this again and turn it sideways, it will disappear as I move over to the form. The same is true for Server Explorer as well as for the toolbox. So as I click on Server Explorer, as I click on Toolbox, both of those expose this feature. As you look around at the other panes that are available in here, you'll see these same little tacks, if you will, that allow us to make this available all the time and not hidden. So what we want to do is go onto our toolbox here and do something pretty simple. We'll do our traditional Hello World application. It just wouldn't be right if we didn't. So what we'll do is we'll draw a button on here. Now we see the button appear. We can change its caption. One of the things that you'll notice as you work with all of the controls inside of Visual Studio.net is instead of a button having a caption property and a text box having a text property, all of the controls are more homogenized. This button has a text property where we can change the caption. So we'll say, Hello World. And in true fashion, we'll put the exclamation point on. So that's how we'll put the caption. We'll now put a text box on our form. So we'll take a text box here. And this text box, we can align it in some meaningful way. We can make this form a lot smaller, do a little usability here for our end users. Make it easier to see like this. This text box, as I mentioned, now has a text property. We'll erase what's there. So very good. We have this text box and we have our button. What we want to do now is we want to add some code to it. So we'll just double click on the button. This will open up our code window. When the code window is open, now we can actually add some code to the event handler for that button. What we're going to do then is, in this event handler, go over and we're going to use a tried and true function call, the message box. We get the nice IntelliSense here. We'll say what our prompt is supposed to be, and what we want our prompt to be is our text box. And we had a text box called text box 1, I think. And sure enough, as that comes up, we can then choose our text property. That'll be the prompt. Then any buttons. And when we click on, when we put in the comma, the IntelliSense is going to pick up a little more rich information than we had in previous versions of Visual Basic. When we went in here to specify the constants for built-in functions like this, we wouldn't see, for example, message box style and then all of these constants. We would just see the list of constants. But the way Visual Studio works, and because of the way we use namespaces and these object libraries, we're going to see a little more rich information sometimes in our IntelliSense. What we'll do is just use information, because that's probably the easiest one. And then we just need a title. So we'll just say title 1. Something pretty easy. We'll end our paren. So that's what we're going to do. Let's save this project so that everything is saved properly. If we click on here, it's going to save all of our files. If we click here, it'll just save this form. We'll save all of them. So we're ready to go. What we want to do is run the application. So we're going to go right here to start. We have two different options as we begin. We can go into debug, or we could do a released version when we start. We'll just do a debug version for now. So we hit here, and now we see the form come up. So what we want to do is just add some text in here. Hello world. We click our button, and hello world works. Well, now let's keep this application simple like this, and let's go back and look at what's going on inside of here, as well as what we see happening inside the Solution Explorer window. So as we're back here, because we compiled the application, we got a lot of output information here from the debug standpoint, and we'll take a look at that a little bit later. So what we'll do is we'll just make that one hide for us. Now what we want is to just take a peek at what's happening inside of here. We noted before that we have a public class called form1. This is actually an instance from system windows forms.form. So we're actually creating an instance of this form. There's something happening right here inside the IDE, and it says this is Windows Form Designer generated code. As I hovered over it, you'll notice that the internal code is exposed, so we get kind of a feel for what's going on inside here. There's a region here. If we click this, it'll actually open up all of the code. So now it's all there. If we want to, we can just close that region by clicking here, and it will close it out. So this is a way that Visual Studio outlines our code for us. So as I open that up again, we can see that, let's take a peek at what's happening. First of all, we have a sub called new. And this it says here Windows Form Designer generated code. And it's going to contain code inside here all the way down to, we see public sub and sub. Then we see public protected overloads, overrides, sub dispose. Dispose is a method we can call when we're actually destroying the object. It's a lot like the form unload event in Visual Basic 6. Then we have a couple friend events here. And moving down, this is where we're actually specifying what the look and feel of the text box and the button is supposed to be. So that's being specified here. Here's where we're specifying what the form is supposed to look like, what its name and what its text value is, and then we end our sub. So to start the whole thing off, we have this sub right here called new. My base has to do with the form itself. So we're creating a brand new form and we're initializing it. When it initializes then, that's when we're going to run this code right down here to actually specify new values. In fact, here's where we're instantiating the text box itself. Me.textbox says this form text box, and we're creating a new instance of system.windows.forms.textbox. We're specifying the location where we're starting the drawing point from. We could actually move it right now by simply changing this to 128. That is a way of repositioning it on the form. Let's go back to our form design. We did move it. It was barely perceptible. There we go. So now we've moved it by specifying 128 as its starting point. We could change other things. We'll put that back the way we want it. This is a real change for people who are accustomed to doing Visual Basic development and who are not accustomed to dealing with the low-level aspects of the controls that they use. For example, the name of our text box. And here we're specifying its size. We could make it larger. Right here, we'll just change this to 60. Go back and look at our form, and you'll see it takes just a moment, and it's going to update it. We've put it back the way it's supposed to be. So we changed its location, and that's what we wanted it to do. So here we're specifying height, width, so on. Our tab index, tab order, we don't have any text in there. If we put in some text right here, go back to our form, we'll see the text appear. So not only can we work with the properties of our control right here inside this code window. In fact, I find myself working with the coded properties almost as frequently now as I do actually clicking here and then specifying, for example, its text property. It's right here, design text box. So with that in place, let's shrink this form up again so that it's a more reasonable size. Another thing we want to look at is go back to our Solution Explorer itself and take a look at what's going on in there. We noticed that inside the code window, we were using system.windows.forms. That's what we were specifying right up here, system.windows.forms.button. Well, let's look at what that looks like here. So we have system.windows.forms. This is the namespace that we're referencing here. Now, another way of looking at this, because we're not getting much information back, we know that hierarchically, we've got some references to different libraries here, but what if we wanted to look at those? So we can open up the object browser. And this is a nice tool. It's not unlike the one that was in the previous version of Visual Studio, but it has richer information because the libraries that we're using expose more information. So as we look here, we're going to go to system.windows.forms, and this is where we were working with the form itself. We can see what it exposes. So we're working with system.windows.forms. We can see some of the constants appearing here for its appearance and so on. We can also see some of the controls that we were using. So here's our button control right here. If we expand that out, we can see some different aspects of the control. This has a lot more information than we're accustomed to seeing in previous versions. So as we click through, we just get more and more and more. Now, to be sure, a lot of this information we don't use cognitively. It's being done in the background, but it's all there. So these are some of the things that we can take a look at as we go through. We have a button control. There's our checkbox, our text box, all the way down to our text box, which is going to be fairly far down. With a larger screen resolution, it's much easier to navigate. And here's our text box right here. So the object browser is pretty nice. One of the shortcuts you can use to open up the object browser, which we can close here. If you want to look at the object browser, is Control-Alt-J. That will open up the object browser for you fairly easily. Another attractive part is just this window is easy to work with. Here we're looking at the start page, a form, then the code itself, the object browser. You can close these at any time by clicking here. So what we've seen in this demonstration is a very easy way to get up and going with a project. What we want to do then is save our project and close it out. So we'll close our solution. What we'll do is we'll take a peek at the actual file system and see what these files look like where they're being stored. This will be the final thing we do here. So go into our projects, and we created a directory called Students1. And here we see the directory. And in here are a couple of files. One is our SLN file. This is our main solution file. And we have another accompanying file. This one has some user options in it. We'll open this one up in, say, TextPad. What we'll see after we open it up is some information. For example, we see up at the top what the format and version is, some project information, where the location is of the file. It's in our Students1 directory. Here's the name of the actual project, VBPROJ. What's nice is that these are readable and even alterable using a text editor. If we go into the Students1 directory, we'll see our project file right here. You can open that up in TextPad. We'll see it's a Visual Basic project, some versioning information, all kinds of information. We obviously won't go into each of these options, but there are a lot of settings, and as you build more sophisticated applications, you may want to alter some of these settings. Typically, you don't want to alter them outside of Visual Studio, however. This is also, we can even look at files, for example, this assembly file has information about just some basic assembly information. Here's the GUID for our assembly. So just so you know that these files are here, typically, again, you're not going to alter these files using the text editor. You'll want to wait until you're inside of Visual Studio, but they are alterable here.